Hey everyone, it's Lassie and welcome back to Virtual Paddock. Today with part 2 of the history of the Porsche 911. It's 1973, about 10 years since the 911 was first presented, and it's time for some bigger changes. Though not necessarily due to the car's age, but because of a new law in the US, which required that any impact at up to 5 miles an hour could not damage the car. So for the 1974 model year, the 911 got bigger front and rear bumpers with integrated turn signals at the front, and this is known as the G series or G model. Because starting with the 1968 model year, each one is considered a series and labeled with a letter. So the 1968 model year is the A series, 1969 is B series, and so forth. And so 1974 is the G series. And technically, the G series only refers to the model year 1974, and 75 would be the H series. But because of the pretty significant changes that came with the G series, it's commonly considered the second generation of the 911. In fact, the whole 74 till 89 period tends to be called the G model. Another change with the G series was the engine size, which was overall 2.7 liters now. There are a few different versions available, from 150 horsepower up to 210 horsepower. But just 1 year later, for the 1975 model year, Porsche presented an even more powerful version, the 911 Turbo. With 260 horsepower from a 3-liter turbocharged flat 6, which a few years later they already increased to 3.3 with 300 horsepower. It looked more aggressive as well, with wider fenders and a massive rear spoiler. So quite a number of changes. In fact, internally it even had its own project number. And Porsche enthusiasts will know this. This is of course the 930, but was marketed as the 911 Turbo. And at the time of its introduction, it was the fastest production car available in Germany. So let's take one for a drive. Alright, so here I am in the 930 911 Turbo. And this particular one is a 3.3, so late 70s and onwards, with 300 horsepower. But even this wasn't the most powerful version ever of the 930. Because in the mid-80s, Porsche then started offering an option known as WLS. It stood for Werksleistungssteigerung, works power increase. If you chose that, you had to add an oil cooler at the front, they did some modifications to the exhaust system. The result was that the car didn't have 300 horsepower, but 330. So adding power to an already kinda scary car. And when I say kinda scary, the 930 was considered to be a bit of a WIDOWMAKER. Was considered a very challenging car to drive. And it wasn't just amateurs saying that. In fact, even Walter Röhrl, German rally legend, who even won in Group B, he owned an early 930. And even he said that if really pushed it, it was a very challenging car to drive. So if someone like him says that, you better believe it. regarding the different versions, there are a few ways you can tell the 3.3 apart from the 3 liter. Most notably, it's the fact that the rear spoiler on the 3.3 isn't necessarily bigger, but just kind of beefier. The grille on it is bigger, and on the technical side, the 3 liter ones didn't have an intercooler, but the 3.3 did. In fact, the intercooler was part of what made a power increase possible. Simply because cooler air is denser, and thus you could have more air in the engine with more compression, and thus more power. Really fun car to drive here on these curvy mountain roads. Now, the turbo was offered for pretty much the entire length that the entire time that G model was offered. As said, it was introduced a year after the G model was introduced. But they did make one change in its final year. Because for the longest time, the turbo had a 4-speed gearbox, and only in its last year did they give it a 5-speed. Now in the late 70s, Porsche thinned out the 911 range a bit. It was a naturally aspirated 911 SC with a 3-liter engine producing around 180 horsepower. And of course the turbo with 3.3 now. And Ernst Fuhrmann, Porsche's then CEO, he actually wanted to discontinue the 911 going into the 80s and essentially have the new 928 replace it. But that didn't really work. The 911 is a sports car, whereas the 928 was much more of a GT. And in 1980, Porsche actually suffered an overall loss for the first time. So Fuhrmann was replaced by Peter Werner Schutz, and Schutz decided to not discontinue the 911. In fact, at the 1981 Frankfurt Motor Show, Porsche even presented a new body style, the 911 Cabriolet. Another change was to come from 1984. The 911 SC got both a new name and a new engine. It was now called the 911 Carrera, with a 3.2-liter engine producing up to 231 horsepower. So let's go for a drive with it. Right, so here I am in a 1984 Porsche 911 Carrera. This car actually marked a shift in the badging of the 911. Because for the first few years of the G model, the Carrera name was reserved for the top naturally aspirated 911, so the most powerful one below the turbo. And actually, the first turbos in the US were actually badged as Carrera Turbo. Then later, in the late 70s, as I mentioned, they switched it down, they narrowed it down to only the 911 SC and the turbo. Then for 1984, the 911 SC renamed to Carrera and got the 3.2. And ever since then, the Carrera has been the 911 base model. And that's still the case today. Now this car also features an option that's very desirable today, internally it was called the M491, but it's better known as the turbo look. And that's what it would do. It would give the 911 Carrera the look of the turbo, with wider fenders in both front and rear, also the turbo's brakes. And the full package even included the spoiler. Then you could opt out that, would actually make it slightly cheaper. It would be documented as another option called M470. And that's actually what this particular one is. So this one has the wider body, it's got the turbo brakes, but doesn't have the spoiler. And overall there are only, I think around 3,500, it was like 3,640 around. And that's for all three body styles. So coupe, cabriolet and targa combined. And speaking of the cabriolet, when they presented it, Porsche were a bit of a tease with that one. Because the prototype that they showed at the 1981 Frankfurt Motor Show, that one had four-wheel drive and was turbocharged. But when they actually started offering it in 1983, it was only for the 911 SC, then obviously later for the Carrera. So it was only rear-wheel drive and only naturally aspirated. And by the way, the reason Porsche waited so long to introduce a 911 Cabriolet was because there had been kind of a law pending in the US that might have outlawed cabriolets, that might have outlawed convertibles. And the US market has always been very important for Porsche. In fact, for 1976, they actually, for 1 year, offered the 912 again, just for the US market, and was then known as the 912E. But then when it became clear that cabriolets weren't going to be outlawed, Porsche finally decided to introduce a 911 Cabriolet. And regarding what they seem to promise with the Cabriolet prototype, it would still be a few years before the first all-wheel drive 911 would come out. In fact, that wouldn't happen until the next generation of 911. Now, by the end of the 1980s, the 911 was showing its age more and more. It had been in production for about 25 years, and even the G model had been around for 15 years at this point. So if Porsche wanted to keep the 911, they'd have to make some bigger changes. But more about those in part 3. And for now, thanks for watching, I hope you enjoyed this video. So, till next time, use the downfalls, and see you soon.